React.js. In this video, we are going to go over everything that you need to know to be effective with React. We're going to have a look at what React actually is, some key concepts, how we're going to actually set up React, and some of the key methodologies that you're going to need to know to use React effectively. So let's get started. So what is React? You may have heard this term several times before you even jumped into front-end development. It may be even one of the reasons you went into front-end development or found out about it. Well, simply put, React is a JavaScript library, and it was created by Facebook. It was initially created to help solve problems at Facebook with things like the timeline, managing the ever-increasing complexity of the UI, and trying to be as data efficient as possible. And if you can imagine, a huge part of the world's population was using Facebook. Well, they really needed to make sure that every single component part of the website was data efficient. Not only that, it helped Facebook as a team build user interface for websites and applications. So it wasn't just websites, it ranged for many things. And from that genesis of that need in Facebook, it took over the front-end ecosystem. At the time, it was Angular that was dominant, which was made by Google, and React from Facebook then exploded in about 2016 and just completely dominated and took over. In the end, major companies like Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, Airbnb, just to say a few, use React to build their user interfaces, making it one of the most popular tools in the tech industry. And like I said, it has absolutely dominated all the custom applications and websites out there, whereas 60% of the job postings for front-end development are dominated by React, and it is a required or preferred skill for those jobs. So if you want to have the highest chance of getting a job as a front-end developer, React is the best way to go. Now we've gone over what React is, but let's actually touch on what React isn't, because there's probably quite a few misconceptions. And some of these things on this list are probably going to get asked in an interview. So it's very, very important to make sure you understand these 3 points. React is not a front-end framework. Things like Vue.js, AngularJS are front-end frameworks, but React is not. React is a library, very different to a framework. A framework is something that has everything that comes with it. So the router, the state management, things like that. React doesn't need that because they leave it up to you. Because React is, and this is the second point on the list, not an opinionated library. So what that means is it doesn't tell you how to use it. It doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't tell you how to manage your routes. So those are the first 2 points on the list. And the last point is it is not a programming language. Now this is something I see every now and then, that some people might misconstrue React as a programming language and put it on the same level as JavaScript. Where in actuality, JavaScript is what React is made from. It is built in JavaScript. So it is a JavaScript library used to build JavaScript applications for the front end on the web. So just to recap, React is not a front-end framework, it's a library. It is not an opinionated library at all. It doesn't tell you how to use it. There are lots and lots of plugins and modules and things you can add for it. So it's up to you how you use it. And it is also not a programming language. Now, these are really good things to remember because, like I said, generally these things can get asked in an interview. Now let's have a look at some React key concepts. These are the things that really make React what it is and make it take over such a huge part of the web development landscape. Now, to understand the very first concept, we need to understand what the DOM is. You may have heard this before, but it is the document object model. This is the thing that makes up your website. So if you look on the graph, it starts from the document and everything within it in a hierarchy with HTML, head, body, title makes up the document object model. So whenever you create a website with an index.html, a CSS file, or a JavaScript file, it all gets added to the document object model. Now that we're using React, things are going to be slightly different. This is a bit of an advanced way of doing web development. This is a bit of an advanced way of doing web development, and that is by using the virtual DOM. Before, we had the document object model, which was just the vanilla one, which is the one on the right here. And on the left here is the virtual DOM, which comes from React. So React maintains a lightweight copy of the real DOM in memory, known as the virtual DOM. So this isn't permanent, it's just in memory. So on refresh, on rebuild, it changes. But it only changes when the state or the props of a component change. So properties of a component or the state of a component. And we'll go into that later. But if anything like that changes within React, it then updates the virtual DOM. So this is React, this is what we're coding in. And if anything changes, it puts it in to the virtual DOM. So these two red dots here are our changes. And then this is the existing virtual DOM that React has applied. And when we make a change, it patches it up against the virtual DOM and then changes the real DOM. And it does this by applying itself on top of it. And this is what we call the reconciliation process. And this is very important. This is what makes React React. Now, reconciliation is the process in which React compares the virtual DOM, which is this. This is the comparison between the two, between the previous version of the virtual DOM. And it's the diffing algorithm between these two that determines, with, if you can see this arrow, what has changed with these purple dots here. And that is your eventual change once it's done the diffing algorithm with reconciliation. Now, I know these are a lot of terms being thrown at you, but it's important to understand why such a huge framework is popular and why it makes such a huge difference. Because before this, we didn't really have anything as good as this, as quick as this, as clever as this until then. And since then, React has improved and added so many more things, but this is one of the core things that makes React above and beyond better than anything that we had before. Now, instead of re-rendering the entire DOM, so just completely rewriting it from top to bottom, React, very importantly, only updates the specific parts that have changed. So these two purple bits here, and you can see the rest in yellow stays unchanged, which is the rest of your website. Very, very clever. And this efficient update process is what gives React its performance benefits. And that brings us into the final bit about React, which is its reactive updates. So this is right at the end of the process. This term is often used to describe how React updates. Now, React Updates is the term that is basically used to describe how the UI responds to changes in state or properties, or as we know in React, props. And when a component state or props actually change, React then reactively updates only the parts of the DOM that need to be updated, hence the reactive update. So just to summarize, React's efficiency in updating only the necessary parts of the DOM is primarily due to the virtual DOM and the reconciliation process, which enable reactive updates in your application. That is the full process from start to finish, with the virtual DOM, reconciliation, and then the reactive update at the very end. And that is why React is called React, because the very last process is the reactive update. Now that we have an understanding of what React is, why it came to be, and what are the key concepts, let's actually go ahead and set up React and start looking at some of the key methods that make React what it is. Let's start by visiting React's website itself, react.dev. So this is react.dev, the home of React. This is where you can go to learn all about React and figure out some of the API references. So if you click here, where it says Learn React, you can see React's entire documentation. So if you ever get stuck, or if you ever want to just look up a concept or look up a hook, you can just go here and start looking through them. It even gives you a guide on how to install it. But we're going to do that in this video in just a moment. Now, there are several ways you can install React. The traditional way to install React, and you may have heard about this, is the Create React app. This was something back in 2016 that everybody did, and even up till recently. But things have changed. We no longer use Create React app as a standard just because it has so much bloat and so much unnecessary things that it installs in a way that people don't even use React anymore. Because React is actually fairly old now. It's probably coming on to 10 years soon that it's been in use and it's been in the community. So that's ancient in terms of web development technology and JavaScript libraries. So this whole system of setting up is very outdated. Now, the most accepted way of setting up React by the community is using Vite. Vite is a modern, lightweight tool that makes starting a React project faster and simpler. It is a great front-end tool that you can use for multiple types of libraries and projects and frameworks. And in this instance, it is perfect for starting just a very quick React project. So you can go to this, going to vitejs.dev, and it includes only what you need without the extra bloat. And on the website, if you go to get started, it should tell you how to install what you need and everything that's included, all the browser support, and it even gives you some templates to download and set up. So if you want a specific one straight off the bat and you click the React one, you can then go down here and just set up whichever one you want. So you could have TypeScript, Vanilla TS, React TS, Svelte, whatever you want. But the simplest way to do it is just running this command, npm create vite at latest, because what it does is it runs you through a whole setup process and you just choose the options you want. It makes life a lot simpler than having to specifically write in all these commands into the terminal. So without further ado, let's go get set up in VS Code. So open up your VS Code. Let's open up our terminal. So if we go to terminal, new terminal, and then we just change directory into the place that we want to build it. So for example, if you're in the root directory, depending on where you are, you can type in cd and you can choose where you want to go. So I'm currently in my root directory, so I want to go to sites, and then that'll take me to my sites folder. And then from there, I'm going to go to the project or folder I want to set up in. So I'll go to front-end now projects, and I'll go into tutorials, and then I'll set up my project. So I will type in npm create vite at latest, and that's all you need. And then I get to name my project. So I'll call mine React Setup. And then you get to choose the framework you want to install with React. Now, React isn't a framework, but I guess it's been lumped together with other frameworks. Now, these are all definitely frameworks, but React is, like we said, a library, but we'll forgive them for that and just click enter once we've selected it. And then we can choose the variation that we want. We don't want TypeScript just yet. We'll use JavaScript for now. And so once you go down to that, press enter, and it should install it for you. So now it tells you the next steps you need to do. So it says cd react setup. So you can copy that and paste it in. And now you're in your project folder. So I'll click clear, and then I'll do npm install. And this should install everything to do with React and Vite. Brilliant. That's installed. And what you need to do is you need to make sure that you've got node version 18 to 20. And you can do this by typing node -- version. And then you can see that I've got node version 18.17 or 0. Now make sure that you've always got the correct node version to run Vite. Sometimes it's 1820 or plus whatever that is. And if you ever get an error, that's probably why. So that's all fine and dandy. Let's actually run the server. So we do that by typing in npm run dev. And you can see here that now that we're running the project, it's giving us our local host here. So let's command and left click there. And this is our project. We can see here the Vite logo, which has a nice cool glow animation when you hover over, and our React logo, which also has a nice cool blue glow animation as well. So together, this is the ultimate starter project. If you're ever starting a React app, I would highly recommend installing it with Vite, because right away you've got interactivity already coded in, and it tells you exactly where to go edit it. So your source app.js, and it says edit this file, and save to test your hot module reloading, or HMR. Now, hot module reloading is essentially when you make a change in your code, it automatically updates the page for you. Whereas if you're working on a project without Vite or something like that, or some kind of way of running a server locally, you have to refresh the page every time you make a change, which can get a little annoying over time, especially if you're doing a lot of work and you want to test if something's looking right or feeling right side by side, and it just saves a hell of a lot of time. So let's go test out the hot module reloading and have a look at source app.jsx and basically have a little tour of React as well and see what it looks like it's set up. So within here, we can just go to the Explorer on the top left for React, and we'll go to Open Folder, and then we'll find our project, which is React Setup, and I'll click Open, and then we've opened our project. So right off the bat, we can see that we've got our node modules folder from installing using npm, and that's got all our React Vite stuff in here, all the libraries and modules that make it work. We also have our public folder, which is essentially all the public files that we want when we build the project to be. And then we have our source folder. So this is where everything that we work on lives. So this has got our assets in it. This has got our app.css, so that our CSS file for the React project. It's got an index CSS, which is the global CSS file for React. And it's got a main.jsx. So I'll go over the React stuff first, and then I'll go over the project build. So essentially, when you make a React project, it has to have an entry point to attach the virtual DOM to, as we saw earlier. And a main.jsx is how it's done in React. And essentially, we're creating a root, which is getting a document get element by ID here, which is using normal JavaScript, and it's checking for the root ID. So if I go down here to index.html, you can see that in this, there's a div with a root of ID. And then up here in main.jsx, it's hooking into that and then rendering out React in strict mode, which basically means it lets you get away with less, because generally JavaScript is very forgiving and lets you get away with a lot of errors, whereas this does not. This makes sure that you fix these in development mode and doesn't allow you to push it until these are done, until you've resolved the errors. So that's what strict mode is. And then within here, you've got your app component. So a component generally looks like this. It's like a normal HTML element, but it's got a custom name of the component. Now, this is something that you've created, and then it's self-closed. So it doesn't have, like, for example, another closing element like this. It can do, but generally it's self-closing. So that is the app component. Let's click here and go in, and that'll take us to app.js. And you can see that this is the boilerplate code, the stuff that comes with Vite that we saw on the page. And if we want to make a change, let's go to the title here. So it goes vite.react. We can go, for example, Harry Ashton. And then we just make sure that the terminal is running. So we go npm run dev, and then we can see that that has changed. And if I make another change to it, you can see that that updates as well. And it's still interactive and reactive, which is brilliant. So now let's just have a quick tour of some of the other stuff that was set up with the project. So the vite.config.js is essentially the configuration file for Vite. You don't need to worry too much about this, other than we're using the plugin React to make this all work. And that's been imported from Vite.js directly, and it's the plugin React tool. And yeah, this is just the configuration. So when you get a bit more into Vite, you get a bit more into React, you can then configure this how you want and get into a bit more customization as time goes on. But for now, this is fine. You don't need to tweak it too much. And then this is just the README that comes with it, the boilerplate README. So that's fine. And then we have eslint config.js. So eslint is essentially a tool to clear out some of the bad stuff on your project, which is why it's called a linter. It's essentially to decide on a style and a set of rules for your project, and you are then to follow them essentially throughout every single file and document that's relevant to the settings you have. So imagine this as a custom list of rules. You can download presets. So I know Airbnb has a very classic ESLint preset for how you should run a React project. And there's many more out there. And what it does is it just makes sure that you're writing code in the way that's set out in these rules, and you're able to set them or you're able to download them from someone else. And that's what ESLint is, and that's what this configuration file is. So you don't need to worry too much about it unless you want to be a bit brave and go ahead and change some of these settings to be a bit more lenient or to suit your needs. But that's essentially what ESLint is, and it's probably worth doing some research into it and different presets that suit your needs. Aside from that, we have some assets within the source folder, and then obviously the git ignore file, which we've gone over in other tutorials, which is essentially all the stuff you want Git to ignore when you set up a project. And then the index.html, which is the entry point for React, and essentially gets hooked on by the root, and the JavaScript comes from here. So this is the script that introduces the JavaScript. And then when you build a project, so if we go here and go npm run build, it builds the project for you and tells you exactly where it's put it. So if you ever try to put this on GitHub or Vercel or Netlify, it would be ran from the dist folder here. And this is how a server would run your project. Okay, now we don't need the index.html open or the main.jsx because we're not going to be actively working in them. What we will be working in is the app.jsx for learning some of our concepts. So we'll just make sure we're running the server again. So npm run dev. All right, let's go to the top here and let's start removing some of this boilerplate code and simplifying it down. So we'll delete it to this point and we can get rid of this useState hook, and we can get rid of all of these imports here because we don't need them. We'll go to app.css and we'll then just essentially delete all of this because we don't need any of this. And then we go to index.css, and I'm happy to keep some of this root styling as it is. It shouldn't affect us too much. Okay, so now that we've sorted out the CSS and the app.jsx, let's go take a look at the project. So the project now is just a blank project, and inside it, what we have here are these empty brackets. Now in React, what they are called are React fragments. And essentially what these are is empty fragments that when React converts down to HTML is created as divs. Now you can also write these like this, so React fragment, and that works as well. But most people just leave them empty like this, and then React recognizes that as a fragment. And they can be very useful, as you'll come to find out later in the future as you use more JavaScript and conditional rendering in React in the future. But for now, what we'll do is we'll just put in a hello world and we'll start here and we'll say my first React app, and we'll turn this into a div and we'll give it a class name of container, and we'll go to app.css and add the class name container with a max width of 1200 pixels and margin auto. We'll say width 100%. And if we inspect this, oh, we forgot to add a display. We'll say display block, and just an app.css. We'll just add some styling for the root. So we'll say width 100%, and there we go. So now we have this in the center, and that looks fine. So let's go ahead and look at our app.jsx and start to look at using components. Now, components are the building blocks of a React application. They encapsulate UI and logic and can be reused across your application, which is one of the biggest pluses of using React. It is very much a component-driven library and a very component-driven of building an application. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a component and use it in here. So if we go here and we'll create a new folder and we'll call it components. And then within there, we'll create a new file and we'll call it button.jsx. And essentially what this does is it creates a React component called JSX. Now, very importantly, if you create a component in a React project, you have to remember to capitalize the component name. It has to be with an initialized name. So it would be a capital B and then the rest of the name button. And if you look at some of the other components within React, if it is a component, it's got an initialized first character. This is just considered a React best practice for naming. It doesn't have many, advisedly, but that is one of them, that when you create a component that you have a capital letter for the first character. Okay, so let's then create a component. Now I'm going to create a functional component, and I'm going to do it using an arrow function. So I'm going to go const custom button, and then I will do equals and then do an arrow and then make a function. And there we go. And then what I'll do is I'll return, and I'll do open curly brackets here, and I'll do a button here. So it's a button component, and I'll say click me. Okay. And then I'll save that. And then what I'll have to do is, to make sure that we can use this elsewhere in the project, I have to export this button. So I'll type in export const custom button. Then I'll go to app.jsx, just make sure we close these CSS files, and I will then import this button here. So I will go import custom button, and then it auto completed it for me. But yeah, from component/button. Now, generally, when you create a component, there are multiple ways you can do it, but yeah, creating a components folder is generally one of the accepted ways of doing it, and then putting in your components within here. But there are many different levels of doing that, and there's different ways of organizing it, which we'll go over in the future. So we'll insert our custom button here. Now, when you add a component to a JSX file, you do it this way. And for those of you wondering what JSX is, you can see these files are called app.jsx, and we've got button.jsx. Well, JSX essentially stands for JavaScript XML, which is basically HTML. So JSX is a syntax extension for JavaScript that looks very, very similar to HTML, as you can see here. And it is used to describe what the UI should look like in a React component. Generally, JSX makes it easier to write and understand the structure of a UI. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like under the hood, JSX. So this is using the old React website. So this is using the old React docs, but it essentially is the same. If you go here, you can see, like, for example, this is our custom button, just like the one we created now. This one's called My Button, ours is called Custom Button. But what essentially React does is it compiles it down into this in JavaScript. It goes react.createElement, My Button, and then adds the properties. In this one, they've got two props. Now, we haven't added any to ours. We're going to do that soon. But essentially, under the hood, JavaScript creates this, React creates this in JavaScript as it compiles down. And if, for example, you just do a simple div, which isn't even a component, and give it a class name of sidebar, it compiles down to react.createElement type div, and it gives you the class name as a property and an object of sidebar. And that's essentially what JSX is. It just takes your HTML-like syntax and converts it down into JavaScript in a way that it can be injected into your index.html that we saw earlier by using the ID of root on your index.html. So there we go. That's JSX in a nutshell. So let's go back to our project and go back to the code. So our component button is a very simple button right now. To use it in the app.jsx, we have to go custom button, and simply, just like that, we've now updated our app.jsx to include our new component. So then if we go to React, we can see that the button is here. Now this is using the styling that was left over from the Vite React demo, which we haven't changed, but that's fine. We don't want to change it too much because we just want to practice with the core React principles for now. So if I click this, it has some styling, I can focus on it, and that's fine. But what if we want to change, for example, the text inside here, or maybe some other information? Well, let's do that now. Let's go to our custom button component file, which is button.js, and let's add some props. And the main way you add props is through here. In this parentheses, you type in props, and then you can add properties, whatever you want. So, for example, if I want to change the text within here, I can say props.label. And what that does is that automatically creates a prop called label by simply using the props attribute here from the functional component. And I then add a custom property And you can call it whatever you want. It shouldn't matter. I've called it label. I can then go to app.jsx and type label, and I can add some text, some custom text, and it should add it. And you can see now that property has updated the button and it has the custom text that we added using the prop. So that's one property that we can add. But what if we want to go one step further? Well, if we want to add then another prop, then if I grab this and I want to add a multiple prop, so then if, for example, I want to change the border color, add a custom border color, I could then do some inline styling on the button. So I could go style, and then to do some custom styling on a HTML element in React, you have to do a double bracket. So the normal bracket that you would do, and then another bracket within here to create a new object. And I would then say border color, and then I would say props.border color. And again, that creates a new prop, which essentially allows us to choose the border color. Now you'll notice one thing. Normally in HTML, you would write your inline CSS in kebab case, which essentially means lowercase with a dash. So it'd be like this. But in JSX, everything is using camel case, which is essentially lowercase first letter, and then the next essential word in the property is uppercase, and it has no dash. And generally that's how colors and styling work in JSX, just as a heads up. Okay, so we've added a border color. Let's go to app.jsx and we'll add border color as a prop, and then we'll say red. And then if I go here, I can see that this has now changed to red, and we can change that again to just prove that that works. So if we change this to green, that now changes green. If I put it to blue, it then changes to blue. And that essentially is how props work in React. Props are inputs to components that allow you to pass data from parent to child components. And props enable component reusability and allow components to be dynamic, as you can see. So I'll show you another quick example. So we've created a component in a very conventional way. We've actually physically created a component, but what if we just want to show how you can make a child component within a component itself? So essentially you create a parent-child component relationship, and I'll show you how. So if we delete this for now, and then delete the import for custom button, what we'll do is within this parent component here, which is app.jsx, we'll now create a child component. So outside of function app, up here on line 3, add our greetings component. And this is a child component that receives props for name. And within here, what we can do is we can add the child component here within the parent component, which is app, and we'll run the greetings component with the property name, and we'll say Alice. So let's go take a look at what that looks like. There we go, hello Alice. But let's try and use this prop just a few more times to see the power of a child component within a parent component. So Alice, Bob, Charlie, and there we go. So those are two of the main ways you can add components to a project. If you want components that aren't really going to get used beyond your parent component, then sometimes it's okay to create very, very small components that have high reusability. And then you can share it across the component file, across the JSX file for that component. And it actually saves you time and code and makes your code look a lot better. Now, if you need to use a component across multiple files and multiple JSX files, then it's better to create it in this way, where the component is within its own JSX file and you can export it to be used in multiple places. And that, in a nutshell, is components. Now, a lot of this information that we have here via props is quite static. You set it once, it doesn't really change. But what if we want the state of the information within the props to change, to basically have a sense of state, and that state can move and change and morph as we interact with the website? Well, state is a built-in React object that allows components to store and manage dynamic data. And that's exactly what we're going to look at now. So we're going to do that by using our very first hook. So I'm just going to clear this up and just reset the file and just turn the clock back. So state determines how a component behaves and renders, making it crucial for creating interactive UIs. And to do that, we're going to use the hook useState to handle it. So the way we invoke useState, the useState hook is this. So we do const, basically declare a variable, and destructure an array. So we use count, which will be the initial value, the actual variable, and then we'll create a method here called setCount, which is essentially how we update the state. Just make sure there's a space on either side, and then we equal useState. So useState is a hook in React, and essentially, and you can simply call it like this. Now I'll explain what we're seeing right now. So again, this is the value, this is how we're setting the value or setting the state, and this is our hook useState. And in here, we can set our initial value. So for this, we're going to set our default value as 0. So we're saying when we get count, it should be 0. And we can test that if we call it here. So we'll say count. And then if we want to data bind information to our JSX, we simply do the curly brackets and you put in your bit of data. So our bit of data will be count from here. Now, normally in HTML, if you want to add data like this, what you'd have to do is use a template literal, and you'd have to put count in as a string or something like that. And you don't really need to do that here. In JSX, you can simply just put a curly brackets anywhere in your HTML, and essentially anything between there is JavaScript. So that is working. Let's go take a look at this now and see what it looks like. Let's just make sure this is running. Now, once we've done that, we just need to make sure that we've imported useState. So we'll import useState from React. Okay, and as soon as we've done that, we can see that useState is now activated. So we'll go check this out, but before we do, let's make sure that we import useState from React. Very important, whenever you use a hook in React, that you import it as well. So if we go here and refresh it, we can now see our count. Let's just move some of these. Let's just make sure we apply the class name of container here. Okay, and there we go. We can now see that there. So that's the default value showing there. If we change that to 3, we can see that changes. And let's just change the default value on here. Let's just go down here and let's just do a bit of global styling. We'll say paragraph has a font size of 30 pixels. There we go. That's a bit bigger and easier to read now. Okay, so that is showing 3. But what if we wanted to increase the amount on there but what if we wanted to increase the count amount on here? So we can do that very easily. I'm just going to set text align center here for now, just to put this in the center. Let's go back to the JSX and add a button. So we'll go to button and we'll put within here the text of increment. So you would add an add event listener in JavaScript and hook it into your HTML. But in JSX, you can actually just add your JavaScript directly to your HTML, your markup, your JSX very easily. So for example, in this onClick container, I'll add an anonymous function and I'll do setCount and I'll say count plus 1. So we just increase it by 1 each time. A very, very simple little change, a little function. And we're using this useState up here, and I'll set this back down to 0. Then if I go here, I can see the increment button here. And if I click it, it goes up bit by bit by bit. But what you'll notice is if I refresh it, it goes back to 0 because that state isn't being saved anywhere. It's just in that session that you're using it. So it's not being saved in local storage. It's not being saved in a cookie. It's not being saved in a database. It's literally just in that session very temporarily. And it's great for UI in the moment, but generally there's not much longevity in state in React unless you say so. Okay, so we've added an increment button, but what if we want to decrease the value and go in the other direction? Could you set 2 different types of state changes in here? So we'll add another button here and we'll say decrement. And now I'm doubting myself if that's a word, but I'm pretty sure it is. We'll put decrease for now, but I'm sure decrement's a word. Set count -1, and we'll say decrease. And I'll put a plus here, and I'll put a minus here. And then if I refresh that, we can go up and we can go down, and it goes into the minus. So brilliant. That works really, really well. And that is the basics really for managing state in functional components. It's a very simple and easy way to manage state in your component. It's a very simple and easy way to manage state in your component. Being honest, useState is probably going to be your most used hook in React and in functional components. Put the last functional components mention out. Okie dokie. So you've seen here that we've used our first hook, but what are hooks? Now you've seen that we've used hooks. Now you see that we've used our first hook, which is useState, but what are hooks? Well, hooks are a way for you to write. But hooks are essentially functions that let you hook into React state lifecycle features from functional components. They also have other different benefits like memoizing your information, choosing what side effects that you can have and that you can run. So for example, we've seen useState, but useEffect is also really, really powerful, and it's probably the second most thing that you're going to use, potentially even the first most thing. It's pretty up there. And we'll have a look how useEffect works and how we can control side effects in React. But essentially, hooks are these pre-built functions from React that help you hook into the state lifecycle and other features of React, which we'll go into now. So let's add a useEffect to our current code now. So what we're going to add is a useEffect here. Just as a best practice, generally you want your state as high up as possible to the top of the function ceiling. So that would be here. This is what we consider the function ceiling. And generally, yeah, you allow it to float as high up as possible. So this is our useEffect. And essentially what this is doing is it is amending the document title when count is basically used. So when count is triggered or via set count, this essentially gets run, and the side effect is that it changes the title. So useEffect is enabling of handling side effects such as fetching data or subscribing to services. It replaces lifecycle methods that we used to have in class components, which is a completely older way of creating components in React. But in that, you used to have these lifecycle methods that were really detailed and verbose, and it's taken away all of that and made life so much simpler. So let's see how this works. Essentially, what would normally happen is just here you would have a dependency array, which is this, and in here you would add things like a count, because the idea of a dependency array, which is essentially just a comma and then an array after, is that every time whatever's in this box changes, this whole useEffect runs. And this essentially says that this, whatever's here, is a side effect of this updating or changing. But one of the unique things about hooks in React is state, for example, doesn't need to be in the dependency array because it's implicit. It's one of the few things that doesn't need to be in here. So you don't need to put state in here. Okay, so let's check this out in our React import at the top. Okay, brilliant. So at the top, we can see that it says you clicked 0 times. And as I increment it, that changes as well. And as I decrease it, that changes too. And that is useEffect. Now we've had a look at two very common hooks in useState and useEffect. Let's have a look at event handling in React. Now in React, you handle user interactions like clicks, form submissions by using event handlers. Event handlers, handling events is a fundamental part to making your React app interactive. And I'll show you just how we can do something like that. So let's use a very familiar hook that we've already used in useState. So we'll import that from React. And it's the same one as before, where we had a count and a set count. Just down below, we'll have Just down below, we'll have a paragraph element, which says how many times you've clicked count. And then we'll have a button, which just simply says click me. And in here, we're going to add our event handler. Now, like before, we had an on-click event handler, which was here. And we're going to pass in our own function. Now, last time we used an anonymous function to essentially, basically handle the logic inline, but we don't need to do that now. The proper way to create an event handler is to actually create a function within your component that handles that. So for example, here we want an event handler for button click. So we'll create a function and we'll do an anonymous function. We'll do an arrow function, and in here all we'll simply do is set count +1. And all that does is that increments the count by 1 every time this function is used. And in an on-click event handler in JSX, all we need to do is just paste in handle click. We don't even need to initialize it because React basically is clever enough to know that this is an event handler and it's a function, so we don't need to do it. Now, there's nothing too special about the actual function that we've created. It's just a normal function, but it's the context in which we use it that makes it an event handler. Because we've used it in an event handler for an interaction like on click, it then becomes one. So let's go take a look now. So this is our page right now. We've got you've clicked 0 times. This is handled by state, and this is handled by an event handler. So if I click it, it now runs that function every time I click on this button. So this is a fundamental part of making your React app interactive and understanding that if you want to create in the future richer interactivity, you could add multiple different sets of things that can happen within your event handler, which ends up making your interactions a lot more richer, allows them to do more things rather than just trying to shoehorn everything in line with very small arrow function. Now, the next thing I want to look at is conditional rendering. Now, conditional rendering is how you render different UI elements or components based on certain conditions. If a user is logged in, show one component. If not, show another. It allows you to create dynamic UIs that respond to different states or inputs. So we'll do this by making a mocked login session. So we'll have a user greeting function here, which returns a H2 that says welcome back. And we'll have one that says, please sign up if you're a guest. And then we'll create a function here called greeting that essentially does a check. So we'll say if is logged in, and then we'll return user greeting, which is this component up here. And you can use functions as components in React. And then if not, we'll then return guest greeting. So to track if the user is logged in or not, we'll set some state. And what we'll say is if they're logged in, that's the value. It checks. And then this is how we set the value through set is logged in. Just as a best practice, usually in a useState hook, in the second part, you always put set something. So that's generally a preface you use, but you can name it whatever you want, but generally that's what people do. We've set a default value of false. So remember before with the counter, we set it to 0 as the default value. Here we're setting it to false. So you can add Boolean values here if you need to. So we want them by default not to be logged in. And then here we want a function to toggle the login state. So we'll say const handle login click, and we'll make it an arrow function because it's just a one-liner. And we'll say set is logged in. We'll say to true. And then we'll say const handle logout click, set is logged in false. So these are two event handlers to basically handle the login state for someone who's logged in and someone who's logged out. So here we're going to have the greeting for someone who is logged in, and we'll say that this is based on the state of who is logged in. So greeting is the component up here, or the function that we created to do the check. So that is running the check and is taking a prop of who is logged in. We obviously just within here need to pass the is logged in prop. So if you only want a very specific prop, you can just pass it in here as an object. If you want to use it as a parameter, then you delete the object and put is logged in, and then it will be a parameter. Then that wouldn't make sense. So we'll do it as an object, so it's a prop. Now, when you want to write a conditional in JSX, the best way to write a conditional is to do open curly brackets and then enter. And like I mentioned before, once you do that, you can actually start writing JavaScript. And then we'll put is logged in, and we'll do a ternary here. So we'll add a question mark. So a ternary is basically almost like an if statement. So like here, we've got a if else statement, but we're going to use a ternary to basically represent that. So it's just shorter, and it's a more of a modern way of doing it in JavaScript. And if you do a question mark, that basically sets the if statement. This becomes the condition. And in here is then the first thing that essentially you return if true. If those conditions are met, then this is what you return. And we're going to return button on click, handle, logout, click. And then we'll put logout as the text. Now, if you want to do the else part, all you do is you do the semicolons or the double colons, and then you put the next argument. So this is the else part basically. So we'll do on click, handle, login, click, and then we'll put login here. And there we go. That is done. So just to recap, we're basically using these event handlers here to check whether to basically log someone in, log someone out. We're using the useState here. And then we're writing a conditional here with the open brackets to check if the user is logged in. And if they are, then this bit here should change in text. And that will be either saying welcome back or please sign up. And it's all being powered by this little function here, which is doing the if check. Okay, let's go take a look. Oh, of course, we have to remember to import useState. So useState from React. Okay, so it says please sign up. So it's basically assuming we're not. So we'll click login, and then it says welcome back. Now we notice that the text is missing here. So let's find out why. So guest greeting is what it takes. Let's just change this to else, and then we'll put that in there. Refresh, type in login. Okay, so the title is correct, but it's the button itself that isn't returning. So if is logged in, then true. And then if false, it should be returning this. Okay, well that's weird. So that I think was a typo. Okay, that should do better now. All right, log out, log in. And there we go. That is our conditional rendering working. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at is lists and keys. Lists are used to render multiple items dynamically, and then keys are unique identifiers for each item in a list. So properly using keys helps React efficiently update and re-render lists of elements. Now, if you're using data a lot in React, which you will be, you kind of need to know how lists and how manipulating data and showing data in React works, because keys are a huge part of that. If you are going to map over some information or have lots of data, then React likes to have individual keys for all those bits of data that it creates. And I'll show you what I mean. So I'll create here a little bit of data, and I'll make it an array of objects, as generally is the case with most data. You have an array here with the square brackets, and then within it you have lots of little objects, and you have key value pairs like ID and apple. And then within here, we'll just add a little h2 that says fruit list. And then what we'll do is we'll create a list, unordered list. And then within here, we'll do some open curly brackets so we can add some JavaScript. And we'll grab the array here, which is items. We'll say items.map, and then we'll do an arrow function, and we'll create an arrow function. And within here, we want to put item, which is essentially the broken down or destructured item from this mapped items array. And within here, what we're going to do is we're going to put some list items. So what we're going to do is within here, we're going to grab the item and destructure it and put name. So because it's an object, I can access the name key very easily and get the value. So item.name should work. And then what we'll do is we'll add a key. So the key here is item.id, and that essentially grabs the ID from here. So let's go take a look at that now. If I refresh that, now currently nothing is showing. We'll just go back here. So we'll make sure we're importing React. So import React from React. Right, of course. So one thing I've done is I've actually made it an anonymous function, but because we're mapping over it, we don't actually need to do that. So I'll delete this little open bracket here. And instead of curly brackets, what we're doing, and I'll just take this out for now, just to kind of show you and illustrate what I mean. We're actually adding more curly parentheses and then another one. And then within here, we'll add the list of key items. Okay, so now we've got two curly brackets here. So essentially, this is the parameter, and this is the outer part of the map method. And then within here, we'll pass the list item with the key and the item name. So then if we go here, we can then see we've got our entire array of objects here. Now, I'm just going to make this a paragraph element just to make it easier. So you can see the items here. But we're using the key as item ID, but there is one more thing we can use. Now, this is okay if you're using just a single item here. If you want to add another parameter here within the map, then what we do is we add a curly bracket, delete one of these, and I'll show you something very cool. We can now add an index parameter. Now you may ask, what does this index parameter do? Well, essentially it's a number in the array. So for example, if I put just here and I go index and then put a dot and then a space, you can see that it's the index array. So remember that arrays start at 0, then it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. So if here we go index +1, we can essentially have these in a numbered list if we want. And what some people also do is, if I just change this now to index, some people actually have the key as the index from the map. And generally this can work, but I mean, key just has to be a unique identifier. It doesn't really matter what it is. So you can use the index. It's a really quick way to add a key, and you know that it's going to be different every time. So if I refresh this now, it still works, and I can still have these numbered if I want. And you can do that. You can have it numbered multiple ways. You don't even need this here. You could have this as a list item, and then just change this to an ordered list. So OL, and then it will see that it's numbered now, but you'd have to style it first. But yeah, that is lists and keys. So the next thing I want to look at is form handling. Now, React provides tools for managing form inputs and handling user inputs through controlled components. Form handling is a common requirement in most web applications. So understanding how to manage form data is pretty crucial. And I'll show you in a fairly straightforward way how form handling can work in React. So I'll add some HTML for us. So here we've just got a H2 of simple form. And then within here, we've got a form with an onSubmit handler that just says handle submit. We're going to create an event handler for this just up here. And essentially, this is a function like we've used before that takes the parameter of event. An event is essentially when you click it, an event is created for that click. And you can actually capture that with this parameter here. And it's always the first parameter of an event handler that has this. And what we're saying here is we want to prevent the default actions of that event handler. So that's reloading and stuff like that. We want to be able to control the reload when we click the submit button, because when you click a submit button on a form inside a form like this, it automatically reloads the page. So once we've handled the submit, we can then send the form data to a server, perform some action. But in this case, what we're doing is we're just console logging the form data, which we're going to record from our form. So let's open this up and see what other information we've got. So we've got a div, a label for the input. So that the input label is name, and it's a type of text, and it's a name input. And essentially this is the value here. So form data.name, which is an object. And then we've got an on change handler here. So we've seen on click, on change is slightly different. So every time something changes within the input, it's then going to trigger this event handler here, which we haven't created, and we're going to do so now. So just above handle submit, we'll add our event handler for the changes in an input. So it's taking the event parameter, which is obviously a part and parcel of event handlers. You get that for free when it's triggered. And we're destructuring event dash target. So the actual target element that when it's clicked, it's basically grabbing the name and the value of the input. So the name in this case would be name, and then the value would be the form data. And then we're using state here to basically spread the information. So this is called a spread operator, when you basically grab all the data from this object, and this is meant for objects, and then it passes it in here. And then on top of that, we're adding some state from name here and putting the value in. So let's create our state for form data, which is this up here. So like you've seen before, it's useState that we're using again, and we're setting the set form data here, which is setting the state, and the form data is essentially name and email, which currently by default is blank. Now, because we've used useState, we need to make sure that we import that from React. Okay, brilliant. And now we've got the handle change for the inputs and the handle submit for the form. We should be all good. The on change is essentially the on change as well, so that's fine. And for the email input, it's just the same, except the value is going to be email here, which is this state here. So this is essentially being used in React state to set the value. And then at the very end, we've got button type submit. Very important, the type submit part. We'll just close this here. And then just some text that says submit. So let's give that a go. Go all the way up here, and we add one up here, and that should resolve it. Okay, brilliant. Right, so this is our form. Let's go to console here, and let's start typing in something. So I'll type in Harry Ashton, and I'll put email as harry@ashton.com and click submit. So if we open this up, we can see that we've got the email here in our object, and we've also got the name Harry Ashton being passed within the form. Using this method of form handling, we can actually record the information in a form and put it into React state via useState and have it ready to send off to the backend in some kind of response in some way. And that is how you handle forms in React on a very basic level. Now, the next thing I want to go over is React Router. Now, React Router is a library for handling navigation in React applications that have multiple views or pages. So we're going to go ahead and install React Router DOM to the project. So we open up the terminal, and if you're already running the server, we'll create a new terminal, and then we'll npm install React Router DOM and click enter. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to do some simple routing. We're just going to create some simple components so that we can show it here once we navigate to different pages. So we'll create a home page, an about page, and a contact page. Now, normally these would be separate components, like we're using app.js. You'd create a separate section for it. So in React, what you might want to do is you might want to create a pages folder. So something like this. And then you would have home.jsx or something like that, and put these in there. But we'll just add it here for now. And then within here, I'll just grab this. I'll add the router wrapper here, and I'll put the div container in here. And then I'll just import router from here. So I'll go import, and then I'll destructure it, and I'll put router from React Router DOM. And then within here, I just want to add some links for the different pages. So what we're doing here is we're creating a link to the home page by using the link component from React Router DOM. And we're saying to take us to this URL. So if you want to go to the home page, it's just /. If you want to go to the about page, you do /about, which is this component here. And then if you want to go to the contact page, that'll take you to contact up there. So we make sure that we add a link here as we're grabbing that from React Router DOM as well. And then we want to define the routes. So we make sure we add a route wrapper to define the routes. And then within here, for a single route, we do route path equals /, and then we'll put element and we'll say that will be home, and then we'll close that off. So let's just have a look to see what we're doing here. So we're grabbing route and route, which we'll just add quickly here as imports, routes, route. And what we're saying is the path for that is /, and the element is home. So we're directly connecting that route to this web page. So path /, which is the same as here. So whenever you link to here, it's going to be picked up on this route. This is essentially listening out for anyone who visits this path. And if you do, it's going to show you this home page. Now let's do the same, but for the about section. So for the about page, we're looking for when someone types in /about, and then it will show them the about element. And then if they go /contact, they will go to the contact section here. Okay, let's go see how that looks. So one thing we forgot to do is just make sure that when we import this, we say browser router as router. This is just the convention for importing router in React. Okay. So there we go. So there are our different pages. Let's just make sure that this is all centerized. So then root, we'll just put text align center. Okay. And I'll just put unlisted, list style, type none. Okay. So this is our menu. So let's go to the about page. And you can see at the top, it's changed to /about, and we can now see the about page here. And contact, you can now see the contact page here, and home. And the best thing is, if I click about, copy and paste it, it'll now open in a new browser as well. Whereas before, if you were to do this just linking to different parts of your site, essentially you wouldn't be able to have them as separate pages. It would just be a single page application, which you don't necessarily always want. So React Router DOM is really good for actually making your React application like a website by adding separate pages and giving you more power for your routes. So let's just go back to here. So browser router wraps your entire application. It enables your React Router to manage the routing. Routes here contains all the individual routes defined for your application. The route here maps a specific path to a component. For example, the path / is mapped to the home component. And link here is used to navigate between routes without refreshing the page. And it's similar to an anchor tag like an A element, but it's to prevent the default page reload behavior. And there we go. That is the very simplistic way of doing routes in React. Now, another way you could do this, if I was to create a new folder and say pages, and then within there, I'll create a new component and I'll say services, and I'll put services.jsx, and I'll put const services, and I'll do a function, and I'll return h1 that says services page. I'll make sure to export that, and then I go to app.js, and I'll make sure I import this. So import services from pages services, and then I'll create a new route here, and I'll put services as the route, and I'll say the element is going to be services. So we haven't got this function on the page, we've got it externally in our pages section, and this is how we would properly and more realistically create our separate pages and have them separated in their own component files, because then you could just go ahead and really detail this out and make it more how you want. But what ends up happening is this ends up becoming like a layout component. So generally you want your routes somewhere where you're going to use it as a layout component. So this essentially would be your layout, and everything inside would then be your essentially your wrapper for it. So we're getting an error here that says the requested module source pages services does not provide an export name default. So in order to use this as a page or as a separate component, we need to add a few more things. So let's go back to services, and we'll go here, export default services. Export default services. Then I refresh, and then it should work. and then we just need to make sure we add the link as well. So go here and add the link. So we'll do the link to services, and we'll add the text as services. Okay, so now we've got our services link here. Everything's working again. If we click that, it then takes us to our pages component services. And that is how React Router works on a very basic level, with inline component pages and external component pages as well. Now, very lastly, what I want to show you is the React developer tools. If you're going to become a React developer, this is one of those things that you really ought to get. So if you go to the official react.dev documentation on React developer tools, it's a browser extension for all Chrome-based browsers, Firefox and Edge. And essentially it looks like this. Within your dev tools, you'll have a little tab that says components and profiler. And it essentially shows you all your components and details, your props and things like that. So if I go to here and I go to this Chrome extension and add to my browser, so I'm using Opera, but it would work exactly the same on Chrome or Brave or anything like that because they're all Chromium browsers. You can just type in React developer tools into Google and it should bring it up. It'll be the first one on the Chrome Web Store, but you can download it for Firefox or whatever. Install that, and then it should be an icon which looks like that. So it's like a atom logo, and make sure you pin it. So just to note that these React Dev tools only work in a production build and not so much a developer environment. And if you're trying to use it in a developer environment, you'll get this error here. And if you are using it in a production environment, it will show that. And essentially what that means is you just have to essentially build the project and post it up somewhere. So something like this. So as this project has built, we'll go to the dist folder, we'll go to the assets. You can see the JavaScript file that is essentially minified React, and you've got the minified CSS as well. And you've got the HTML, which essentially takes in this JavaScript and CSS. And you can put this on somewhere like Vercel and push it up. And then the React Dev tools should work. But again, like I mentioned, it's really handy. It breaks down your components. You can see you can troubleshoot a lot easier this way. And it is really, really good for finding really tricky bugs. So React Dev tools is something I would definitely install if you're planning to push this to production. So if you're planning to put this on something like Vercel, I would definitely grab React developer tools, or if you're putting this on Netlify or GitHub pages. So there we go. That is React, a really powerful tool for building interactive and reactive web pages. And again, it is one of the most sought after preferred ways of building modern applications on the web, used by some of the biggest companies in the world, some of the biggest startups, and just in general in high demand. So it would do you well to learn it, go over this video as many times as you need, and just try building some of the things that we did along with it. So hopefully that helped build your foundational understanding of React, because React is one of those really important pillars to modern front-end development if you choose to specialize in React.